Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Chicago Future's Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Chris Scrable. I'm the Director of Chicago Studies and Experiential Learning in the College at the University of Chicago. Today's presentation continues our series of distinguished lectures, community conversations, and other events that seek to reimagine the future of Chicago as we attempt to move beyond this difficult period in our cities and our nation's history. The Chicago Future Series was developed as a collaboration between two offices within the undergraduate college at the University of Chicago. Chicago Studies offers curricular and co-curricular opportunities for the college community to study, engage with, and positively impact the diverse communities of our world-class city. The Parousia program for public discourse offers courses and programming that aim to develop communicative competence and foster vigorous, inclusive, and productive public discourse within a wide variety of communities. To date, this series has included 6 distinguished lectures and 4 community conversations with representatives of local industries significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. All of these have been recorded and are available on the Chicago Studies website. This spring, our series continues with 2 more conversations. The first will take place a week from Friday and will feature the owners of 2 small businesses. And the second will reflect on the future of our vibrant music scene here in the city. We also have 1 more distinguished lecture featuring Luis Betancourt of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, which will take place 2 weeks from today. The Chicago Future Series as a whole has been generously co-sponsored by the Office of the President of the University of Chicago. And today's session is co-sponsored by our friends in the Neighborhood Schools program, part of the Office of Civic Engagement, and a great way to get involved in the local Chicago public schools around the university's campus. We never meant this series to be one way, and we're excited to be coming to that time of year when students' research and activism take center stage for Chicago Studies. If you're a 4th-year student whose thesis research is focused on Chicago, we encourage you to submit your BA or capstone for consideration for this year's Chicago Studies Research Prize, awarded annually. Our call for student submissions is open through May 10th, and faculty may continue to nominate exceptional BA thesis work through May 14th. More information and a submission form are available under Research on the Chicago Studies website. We encourage all of you to attend our end-of-year research colloquium scheduled for Wednesday, May 26th, which will give us all the opportunity to engage with some of the most outstanding undergraduate thought about the city to emerge from the college this year. If you're a 1st through 3rd year who is passionate about Chicago and interested in helping to set Chicago Studies agenda in the coming academic year, we encourage you to apply for our new Student Advisory Board. We're accepting applications now through May 10th. See our website for additional information or visit chicagostudies.uchicago.edu/SAB for Student Advisory Board. And now it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce this evening's distinguished presenter. Micere Keeles is an associate professor of the Department of Comparative Human Development. Professor Keeles' research aims to improve the educational experiences and outcomes of students from historically marginalized communities. She's also the founding director of the Trauma Responsive Educational Practices Project, a research translation and research practice partnership that aims to connect brain and behavior research on developmental trauma with the realities of school and classroom management. We're so grateful to welcome Professor Keeles this evening.
Thanks, Chris, and happy to be here. And I always have to note, because it's just always a little, for me still, disconcerting, even though I've been on Zoom all this time, when we're doing webinars, because I can't actually see who's out there and don't have a sense of how things are responding and landing. So I'm still trying to have a conversation with you, even though you're not directly in front of me and I can't get any of those visual cues that are helpful for having a conversation. So let's go anyways. Hopefully as you put questions up and things like that, that'll give a sense of how those things are. And I will try to do some kind of attending to that as we go along, just to see if there's anything like pressing coming up that could interject how the presentation is going. So, but otherwise, I'm going to share my screen and start this conversation. And this really is more of a conversation than just a straight presentation, even though I can't see you. So just wanted to make that note that the goal is to invite you in. So sharing my screen. I guess one of the big things to start with is the title of this, and all that's left of the title, and all that really matters of the title to me at this point in where we are with the pandemic is that everything is kind of a cautionary tale, because every time we think we understand something, not necessarily so much about the virus itself, but about how humans and human society is responding or not responding or responding poorly to the challenges that the virus is creating. We are very poor at predicting how things will look in a very recent future meaning often like weeks or months. We think one thing, and because of how we respond and react, the actual near-term future that presents itself within a few weeks or a few months is often quite different than what we would predict, because often we don't respond in ways that give us the best kind of social and societal outcomes. And so really it's a cautionary tale, learning from our further back history, but also our very recent history as we are thinking and making decisions around how to respond as we go forward when we think about recovery from the pandemic. And it's one thing that's really interesting is depending on who I talk to, the very concept of even thinking about and talking about recovery from the pandemic strikes some people as very difficult to even consider, because there's so much still in the midst of it and so much still in distress that the idea of even beginning to discuss a post-pandemic future is challenging for many to imagine. So one of the things that I thought would be helpful when I went back to put this together is thinking about, I went back and looked at the emails that I had with Chris and realized just how much in a state of pandemic fatigue I was back in December when I got the initial email, and how much more I am in that state of pandemic fatigue. But this was just one little snip from the email that Chris had sent on December 17th around what this lecture series was going to be and the focus. And I didn't realize it was this long, but I didn't respond until January 4th. Not because I hadn't been thinking about it, because I had, but it really stumped me. And so, he sent the email asking about thinking of envisioning possible futures for Chicago. And when I look back at some of my response, what really stumped me was I didn't really see, I know a positive future with my issues of inequality is possible, theoretically. I didn't really see it likely coming through in terms of any narrowing of inequality, and particularly education inequality, the things that I was looking at. I was only seeing things growing and growing. And so what my response was asking, like, how upbeat does this presentation need to be for the future? Because I was thinking, if we're looking for a rosy, positive, upbeat presentation, I'm not going to be able to do that. And that's why I was really stuck and stumped trying to think about doing this talk. So one, just seeing the inequality grow, I couldn't see giving a sunshine and roses presentation. And then the other piece, as I think about these issues, is this issue of relative gain and even absolute gain that's happened during the pandemic. So it has really affected us so differently in the United States and around the world based on your social status and the resources that you had before this pandemic hit. I'm sure there have been others in history, but no, not one in my lifetime that I can think of, or recent history, that has really separated and really exploited those underlying inequalities and just ballooned them. And so one of the things that I was thinking about when thinking about the post-pandemic recovery and issues of inequality is that narrowing inequality and thinking about this is, I was really thinking about the issue of privilege and how much privilege has increased during this pandemic, and that people would need to, it would be experienced by many of those who have been privileged by this as giving up gains that have been accrued during this pandemic. So some have been harmed, many have been harmed, but many of us have also gained in relative terms and gained in absolute terms in how we've experienced this pandemic. And so, you know, my thing was just, this is all part of my email response to him, which is like, I am just really certain that I won't have a cheerful presentation. And of course, he came back and said, no, it doesn't have to be cheerful at all. It has to absolutely be grounded in what we know about inequality. And it's not, by the end, it's not, my presentation is not all doom and gloom, but it does make clear that we need to think about the choices, both individually and collectively, the intentional choices that we make when we're thinking about issues of inequality and the recovery from this pandemic. So in some ways, I want to start at the end. And this is, if history is our guide, thinking these are studies over, I think, a 60-year period of disasters happening across 150 countries or so. And this is an aggregate of all of those studies looking at what we know about the impact of pandemics on inequality. And what this is showing is, this is where we are when a pandemic hits, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years after a pandemic event. And this red line that's growing, and then there's a 95% confidence interval around it. But this red line that's growing is the amount of inequality in a given country. And this is across, I believe it was like 150 or 160 countries. And a range of pandemics and natural disasters. And what we see is that the amount of inequality, income inequality, grows in those first few years after a pandemic. And then the gray is the 95% confidence band around it. So if history is our guide, we expect to see growing inequality. And when they look within these countries, if you separate them, when the pandemic is associated with a severe contraction in economic activity, you see even greater inequality growing. So there's still, of course, we are, many would say, not even a year out, and we're not out at all. We are still in the middle of this pandemic. So we don't yet know how this is going to go. But if history is our guide, we have a tremendous amount of concern for the issue of growing inequality. And just a kind of a quick aspect of getting on the same page together. There are many intersecting inequalities. Wage and wealth inequality are the ones that are discussed most often. Of those, let me turn this. Wealth inequality is the one that matters most when we're thinking about what drives the growth in inequality in a society after a pandemic or any kind of disaster. Wealth is the thing that families get to fall back on in order to protect themselves when disasters hit. Inequality, wealth and wage inequality they're caused by other inequalities, so they reinforce each other. They affect then educational inequality, health, inequality, social, political, justice, and others. And all of these things then become an intersecting system that creates the growth in inequality that we've seen over the years. And all of these, the fact that it is all of these intersecting systems of inequalities means that what we really have is inequality of opportunity. And that is the, that's the inequality of opportunity to improve your fortunes and the fortune of your children. So it is the aspect of intergenerational inequality over time. And wage, wealth, education, health, social, political, and justice inequality really sets people up in dramatically different opportunity structures for their future and their children's futures. This is just a quick check so that we, again, have that collective picture, all of us in this virtual space together, of what wage inequality was before the pandemic. So this is that long-term picture from 1910 to 2010. And what these lines show is the percent of the total market income that's going to the top 10% of the families in a given country. And the United States is this one here in orange, gold, maybe. And I'm going to stop that laser pointer because it's not moving the way I want it to. So what we see is this one here in gold is the United States in 1910 to 1940. High levels of inequality, high levels of the share of the income going to that top 10%. We've had these generations where there was a substantial, a significant, huge drop in the level of inequality, but it has grown back over time to a level that is higher than it was in 1910. So before this pandemic hit, there was a tremendous amount of inequality in the United States. And as we all kind of know now with the reporting that's coming out with this pandemic, this virus and the social distancing and the economic effects that it's had has been one that has just truly exploited and magnified these already existing underlying inequalities. A closer kind of time period look, and like I said, that look at wealth inequality. Income and wage and income is what the inequality that comes from differential earnings. This wealth inequality really is that accumulated wealth that's passed down from generation to generation and the inequality in that accumulated wealth. And if you look at this, So the share of the aggregate wealth in the country that goes to those in the upper, middle, and lower income, you just see this huge growing and widening of inequality. So this, again, this is where we were at before the pandemic. And I just have a snapshot of, and we don't know, we don't have any like good solid numbers, and we won't for a few years after the pandemic. After the pandemic is actually over, whenever that date gets marked. So this is kind of just illustrating what I mean by gains accrued during the pandemic. So it's just that there's been a highly selective job loss. So people that were earning less than 30,000, employment has fallen by 14%. People in between 30 and 85,000 in their earnings, where they were at before the pandemic, employment that for those in that middle income bracket have fallen by 4%. And for people earning 85,000, which is not a lot in this day and age, but those earning 85,000 or higher, their employment rates have actually risen slightly since the pandemic. So there has been just a sharp difference in terms of the relative effect of the pandemic on vulnerable people in our society. And this is kind of a graphic representation of that. So if we look back in January, this is kind of seen as the January-February break start of the pandemic, when the first cases were identified and you were beginning to see some effects. Just that huge, if I can go back, that huge drop. But that drop affected us differently based on where you were in the beginning. And the rebound, again, has been dramatically different, so that those who were in that, and again, 60,000, not very high. It's been, as we now know, we're seeing some reports on how the pandemic has been the top kind of 3%, 1% individuals in those very top wealth brackets have absolutely, at an absolute level, gained during this pandemic. But these are, again, greater than 60,000, not that high. But you can see just the idea that those making modestly high wages and above, they have rebounded in a way, their employment levels, where they are higher than what they were at the very start, kind of around January, whereas the other groups are still, especially the lowest wage workers, they have not rebounded nearly as much. So this means that as we are going through this pandemic, inequality in our society is only growing wider and wider. So during this time, there are some of us who are gaining at relative or even absolute levels because of how when you talk about the absolute gains, the way that social distancing and the contraction in spending and the reduction in commute times and all of those things have benefited those of us who can social distance in our jobs and can work from home, that there have been real absolute gains for some people, in addition to just relative gains, as others have, those in lower income and lower status occupations have used up their savings in order to get through the pandemic. Others have been able to increase their savings. So I was not the only one, but when the pandemic hit, and everything that came associated with it, the way that it magnified class differences in inequality, in infection rates and in death rates, the ways that it magnified racial differences in infection rates and in death rates, the ways that it magnified and it quieted in the early days some aspects of our society that allowed us to see the ongoing police brutality, the ways that there was waves of kind of racial panic in terms of the videos that were coming out of just other Americans were reacting to Black people in their communities and in their neighborhoods. And you were able to see these videos where it was questioning people's presence in their very neighborhood. And just that racial panic and all of those other things that were coming out as people were distressed and stressed by the stressors just of the pandemic itself, that then showed up in all of these other ways. Myself and many others went back to Octavia Butler's books. She has many, they're all wonderful. Read them all. Two of them, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, just resonate so much with the current moment of the pandemic. These were published in 1993 and 1998. They were set in like 2025, mid-2020s California that had been destroyed by ecological destruction, political unrest, economic exploitation, a whole host of things, all coalescing together to create what she calls in her books, the pox. But they're not easiest to read because she does not shy away from showing how humanity can prey upon itself in creating distress and then preying upon itself to further that distress. But they're excellent to read and critical to this moment because they're sociological books in the ways that she writes them. So there's I don't know if it's like a social media group or a discussion group, but there's a group that's called Octavia Tried to Warn Us. And she did, she tried. One of the characters in her book described back then the pox. And he said, the pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with obvious problems. We caused the problems, then we sat and watched as they grew into crises. In a 2021 research article on kind of pandemic vulnerability, they describe the COVID-19 as the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath are the result of common, pervasive, and well-recognized human action and inaction. Disasters expose groups that are vulnerable due to prejudice, discrimination, and neglect. And so it's just, I'm making the case, go back and read her books because she puts all of the things that we are talking about in our today in very wonderful, lyrical, and gripping prose that you will just want to read. Not easy reads because it really makes you think about yourself and our society, but really wonderful reads. So that's my plug. Go back and read Octavia Butler. And like I said, I wasn't the only one because her books came back onto the New York Times bestseller lists this fall, as many people kind of turned to her work to help them as a different frame of reference to reflect on what's happening. So sticking with, though, our kind of scientific understanding, in the article from which the research article from which the second quote is taken, the quote about the COVID-19 pandemic, really thinking about vulnerability. And the way they define a natural disaster is that a natural disaster is the interaction between a natural event and existing vulnerabilities. So vulnerability, though, is shaped by our social, economic, political context and other policies and practices. Vulnerability is the condition of a system that exists before it encounters a hazard. Vulnerability to the problem is socially constructed. So just different ways of reinforcing the idea that a natural disaster is simply a natural event that only becomes a disaster when it interacts with our existing vulnerabilities. And so COVID-19 has exposed existing societally created racial disparities in vulnerability when we see just how large the gaps are in infections, severe complications, and death rates. Not to mention the severe disparities in the economic fallout from the pandemic and how that is going to affect for generations. Severe disparities in the extent to which people have lost their homes or experiencing food insecurity and all of those other things that are going to reverberate into generations. So taking up this last line, that COVID-19 has exposed existing societally created racial disparities and vulnerability, and then bringing it really into our local context in Chicago. This is pulling from a series of maps that takes us back into history in order to help us understand the present. So this is redlining, and I'm just trying to think. So on the map, it's Chicago. The different colors are from the Home Loan Corporation's 1930s neighborhood rating and categorization that really affected the kinds, whether they could even get loans and the kinds of loans that families could get to purchase homes, and the interest rates that they would pay, and all of those types of things. And so the color coding, this is where I'm like recreating that little circle. That's us here in Hyde Park, in this area here. The red were marked as hazardous. Don't give home loans in those neighborhoods, or if you do, it's going to be at very high interest rates. The peach is noting that the neighborhood is declining. And again, they're advising against giving loans in those neighborhoods. So this shading was done in the 1930s. The outline, these outlines here that are a little bit darker, are areas that are predominantly Black, that were changing into predominantly Black neighborhoods then, and are solidly predominantly Black neighborhoods today. So these 1930s determinations about neighborhoods and whether and how people could get loans in those neighborhoods, making it difficult for people to get home loans in these neighborhoods, making it difficult for them to then establish a stable ownership class in those neighborhoods, predominantly affected overwhelmingly Black neighborhoods. The same outlines, remember these outlines. So Here you have them, what is overlaying them is census tract level percent Black. So you see how clearly they line up. Remember those outlines? This is where the locations of hospitals in 2011. So you see on the south side of Chicago here, just a dearth of hospitals, and we have a medical crisis that requires hospitalization for many, and underlying disparity. This is the percent, the darker red, the higher levels of asthma among the people who live there. These neighborhoods are often have a higher level of exposure to toxins and many other factors. So you have, again, an underlying vulnerability that is very highly associated with how you're going to react and how sick you're going to get if you do get infected with COVID. And remember, there are fewer hospitals that you're going to be able to go to in this area down here. You're going to have a longer travel time distance. And this last one just has the COVID death rate. And except for this little area here, which is our Hyde Park area, you don't see in these outlines any that have the low death rate. In any of these. And so just the idea that it's underlying vulnerabilities that were set up generations ago that are being exposed through the pandemic. So pandemic-induced educational inequality, which is supposed to be one of the big things that I'm talking about today. We still don't know because it just takes so much time for the information to come in, and because of remote schooling, a lot of testing has not happened. We have lots of clues and lots of guesses. None of them are looking good when we think about issues of inequality. This is also a key area, again, where the idea of the more privileged of us going to need to think about how we respond to the gains that we've made for our children regarding educational inequality during this pandemic. And I'll say a little more clearly about what that is. But essentially, the pandemic, the move and the sudden move to remote schooling magnified underlying racial inequalities in the household and community resources needed to support academic learning. And those racial inequalities are highly connected with socioeconomic disparities also. So this sudden move to homeschooling, remote schooling, meant that more than ever before in our recent history, the resources that one had at home to promote and facilitate and support academic learning suddenly became so much more important and so much more magnified. And we could see in many cases, because of online learning, teachers could see directly into kids' homes and see how different things were in terms of the resources that kids had, see how different things were in terms of the stressors that kids were trying to cope with as they were trying to focus on what was happening in the virtual classroom and things like that. But then, like I said, the caution, it's going to take a long time for the full picture to emerge. So one of the things that I like to do when talking about inequality is go to other countries and seeing how information and data from other countries can help us understand some of the basic issues and then bring it back to the US also. So going to the Netherlands, they were, and also like to pick places that we would like to think of as, well, idyllic and having low levels of inequality and having much more egalitarian and equal society. And they do. So when we see how inequality shows up in those societies, one should always assume that it's going to be even more magnified in ours. So going to the Netherlands, and they shut down, the data from the study that I'm going to show is they had shut down for 7 weeks in the spring. And then they only shut down for 7 weeks, that was it. And then after 7 weeks, they went right back to in-person learning. And so what was the effect of that 7-week shutdown? So, and the heading for this is disparities in educational experiences and therefore the outcomes. When we're thinking about educational inequality and outcomes, it's driven by different experiences and the inputs that we receive regarding academic learning. So this is the looking at kind of like early testing at the end of spring from the effect of a 7-week shutdown that they had. The first is we're looking at boys and girls. It was about the same effect. So one more. This yellow here is the zero, no learning loss. The shutdown resulted in no learning loss from what would have been predicted based on previous years that would have been learned over the last academic year. So the closer they are to this yellow line, the less learning loss there is. Boys and girls had about the same level of learning loss. You see learning loss in math, spelling, reading. When you see boys and girls, it's all of these combined, a composite, math, spelling, and reading. And also you see there's slight differences in the age levels of the students and the composite learning loss score. This one took prior performance, whether they were the bottom, middle, or top in terms of the year before, and how did this 7-week shutdown affect learning loss for those who were in those different categories, and fairly similar. You do see slightly more higher level of learning loss among those in the middle and bottom. But when we look at those categories based on parental education level, lowest, low, and high parent education, you see the largest gap in learning loss. So you still see learning loss from what would have been predicted if they had not had that shutdown among kids with high educated parents. But the largest gap, when you look across all, it's when you're looking at those with lower educated parents versus high educated parents. So focusing in on parental education and learning loss. These tests where they show the learning loss are tests that really assess the extent to which they learn curricular content, the kind of curriculum information that would have been learned that year. And they compare that against some other tests that they took around the same time. But these ones measure broader knowledge that's not kind of based on that, like 4th grade curriculum. Did you learn the things that you were supposed to learn in 4th grade curriculum versus broader kind of knowledge? And you still see that there is some learning loss among the kind of broader knowledge components and growth and thinking that would have been happening over that year. But the biggest is really in that the things that they would have gotten from their teacher based on what they would have learned from the curriculum materials. So the shutdown, 7-week shutdown, not having, going to online and not having that teacher in front of them, still, it just, even for 7 weeks, it really affects learning. And it just shows that we were not set up, and as expected, no surprise, we were not set up. It takes time to learn how to both deliver instruction and learn on Zoom all day long. It just doesn't work as well. There's huge motivational components. There's a lot of what we call labor. There's a lot of labor that teachers do in the classroom to help students learn. And that's hopefully one important thing that we will take away and remember from this, just the amount of labor and work and interaction and the amount of interpersonal work that is part of instruction. It's not just delivering content, but there's a lot of other work associated with it. But this is that look. So this is the Netherlands, just to say, even in a country that is has much lower levels of inequality, stratifying factors, this one using the proxy of parental education as a social status stratifying factor, really affects the resources that families would have had at home in order to support academic learning. And when we're looking at school outcomes, we see a huge effect. So bringing it back to where we're in Chicago. Is this Chicago? No, this is the US broader. And I'll say this again, the picture is still developing. We only have a limited amount of information because there's just not a lot of testing, and not a lot of the testing information has been released. So this is from one preliminary picture. So this is based on testing that happened in the early fall of 2020, but really reflecting learning that happened over the whole 2019-2020 year. And the focus is on the size of the gap. We don't know what the absolute levels of learning loss relative to where kids would have been, but what's coming out is really helping us in the US see the picture regarding the gap that's growing. So the darker blue dots are schools with greater than 50% students of color. And these brighter blue dots are schools with greater than 50% white students. And this spread is just the differential in the learning loss at these different grade levels. So the lowest, as expected for math, would be in kindergarten, because overall, it's not easy for parents to teach kindergartners. Like, that to me is like the most labor that classroom teachers do, is teaching the littlest kids that learning. And so you see a low spread in terms of the inequality growing as represented by learning loss, and the spread growing as you get up to the later grades. The addition as you get into the later grades, like 5th grade, parents at home can be much more facilitators of learning. So if the school and if the teacher gets all the content ready, provides all of that information for students, provides home support guides for the parents where they can help in facilitating learning and all of those things. Parents are going to be much more effective at doing that around fifth graders than say a kindergartner. And so you're seeing, again, just differences in the disparities of how being pulled out of the classroom and not having all of those supports in the classroom and at school, and being really dependent on what the resources that you have at home much more. You're seeing down here with this fifth grade gap very wide in terms of where they would have been relative. The 100 is if there was no learning loss. So as I noted, that is because of differences in educational experiences. So this is a look at in this fall, the fall of this academic year that we are coming to an end of, the extent to which kids were in remote, hybrid, or in person. And you see that Black and Hispanic students were much more likely to be in remote learning. And even more so, I was surprised by this, I didn't know, in that remote learning context. So this is having no live access to teachers. So not in person, not by phone, not by video. So all they have are either learning packets or what is delivered to them through asynchronous content. No live access to a teacher. And that's 8% of white students, 15% of Black students, and 16% of Hispanic students having that no live access. That is absolutely devastating to one's educational experiences. And it's these experiences, differences in experiences, that are showing up in differences in outcomes. Okay, so wrapping up and getting to the end. The challenge ahead. One way to think about this is when who knows when that will be, maybe fall of 2021. I know that there's a strong push towards that, but COVID variants and other mutations, we'll see how those will throw wrenches into the plans. I hope few, because we just really can't take many more. But in the fall of 2021, some third grade students are going to come into third grade having had maybe 14 months of more usual in-person or at least hybrid part of the time in school, in class learning. And some students are going to enter third grade having had 6 months, because there's some students for whom when we went to remote in March of 2020, that they have not yet returned to in-person learning. And so if you think of a first grader who is going in at that time, when they show up again in person for third grade, they're going to have had very little in-person schooling over this time, over the rest of their first year and their second year, their first grade and their second grade. We've never had these types of conditions and experiences before when we're thinking about bringing kids like a national learning context. These differences in the amount of educational experiences and type are going to be very highly correlated with race. It means that teachers are going to have to be able to provide differentiated instruction meaning I have a bunch of kids in front of me, but they have had such different educational experiences that I can't just teach one lesson. I really need to think about how I'm going to differentiate, do my lessons differently in order to meet this huge variability in learning experiences of the students in front of me, so that I don't lose a whole chunk of the classroom. And so a very large level of differentiated instruction and a lot of instructional creativity, because they're going to have to do a lot of social and emotional learning for how to be a student, how to be in the classroom, with some kids, and other kids are going to be in a context of being on track and on time for third grade. So you can have some kids that are where they should be with their third grade learning, and some other kids that have no clue, because they started school, they had like 6-7 months, and then poof, they've been remote learning since then, and suddenly we're going to bring them all back. Definitely not all of them are going to be in the same school and in the same classroom, but there's going to be a real need to think about how we do school when we come back together. We're going to have to attend to the trust gap. One of the reasons there's so much racial disparities in who has returned to the classroom is the extent to which, because of how the pandemic had such huge differences in the racial effects in associations with infections and death rates, families were differentially distressed with regards to whether they should send their kids back. What would be their level of exposure? What if you don't have health insurance? It's really easy to kind of say all families should send their kids back, but what if you don't have health insurance? Your risk for what might happen if your child gets sick is very different. If you don't have health insurance, you can't take off from work, so on and so forth. And what if they come home and infect other people in the family? So the risks are really different. We're not all facing the same risks. And many racial, ethnic, minority, and lower income children were in schools where the school building itself were very different in terms of ventilation, and all of those conditions that would be needed in order to make one feel safe in the middle of this pandemic. So there's a huge trust gap that needs to be attended to if we want to get vulnerable kids and families back in the school. I, of course, have huge questions about whether decision-making will reflect what we have learned. Truthfully, I don't have a lot of hope, but we shall see. We've learned that we don't have to do school the way we've been doing it. Like, we just don't need to. Pandemic, if it's taught us nothing, we can change on a dime and make things different. There's no reason for us to continue summer vacation the way we have, especially for kids in high poverty neighborhoods. There's absolutely no reason or rationale why they would be sent home with limited learning opportunities for the 2 months of summer. Higher income, higher wealth families take those 2 months of summer and pay to provide their kids with lots of enriching opportunities. Again, that's how inequality grows. We've also learned that without connection and engagement, learning does not happen. So before, when we had all kids' bodies in the school building, we could kind of ignore that, okay, we have them here physically, but they're not connected, they're not engaged, they're not learning, they're just physically here. We could ignore that for a lot of kids. Once they went remote, we couldn't ignore that anymore and realize how critical it was to connect and engage, to get them to show up, to get them to log into their Zoom classes and so on and so forth. And so one wonders, when we come back together, will we remember the need for connection and engagement in order to enable learning? We can't continue to ignore the digital divide. The pandemic is not over. There will be other disasters, and even just getting through this disaster, There's going to be need for quite a bit more remote hybrid schooling that's going to have to happen. There are already many districts that are trying to figure out how they're going to plan if variants and mutations or if there's not enough access to the vaccine in the fall when things start to wear off, and all just numerous factors that mean that we can't continue to ignore the digital divide. And also, lastly, just like educators play such a huge role in enabling parents to work. And without that, our economy is going to have a tough time recovering. Without that, the women exiting the labor force is going to be really difficult to turn that around without really putting more value into the needs of educators. So the last thing around educational inequality is when we think about recovery, just the takeaway here is the acceleration, not remediation. There's still continues to be some talk about maybe we should do large scale grade retention and other things like that, that is more among the remediation framework. But really what we know, if we follow the science and educational research, what we need to do is invest in high quality, rigorous, engaging learning opportunities for kids who have been the most harmed, not holding them back and putting them in lower level or in remediated instruction, but really thinking about how do we challenge them? How do we challenge them creatively? How do we do all of those things going forward as the way of catching them up? Otherwise, inequality is just going to grow, because the kids that will be held back would be the kids from the lowest income families, kids with the families with the lowest levels of parent education. So if we do large scale remediation and grade retention, we're only going to be increasing the inequality that's grown over this year, the educational inequality that's grown. So the last two slides is for us, is here together. These are my these are as rosy as I can get. And I think they are rosy, which is that it's not them, but you, in terms of where you put your emphasis on thinking about how recovery is going to happen and how unequal our recovery is going to be. And there's just this concept of that I found really interesting. It was in a New York Times article. Attention management. And it's been helpful because for me, there's so many things that need to be done, but you can only do so many of them. So attention is a limited resource. So pay attention to where you pay attention. Direct it toward people, ideas, and causes that are worthy of our precious resource of attention. Pressing problems like income and racial inequality are in some part issues of where we direct our attention and the resources that we value. So there are 1,000,001 fires out there and many places where we can direct our attention for what needs to be done. Social media is not helpful because there are 1,000,001 trying to find a good word, unhelpful, time wasting, not worthy of your attention, time sinks. And so pay attention to where you pay attention. And if issues of inequality matter, pay attention and think about how you can direct your time and resource to anything associated with that. And lastly, this is from Octavia Butler, and why you should go back to her books. Find your positive obsession. A sweet and powerful positive obsession blunts pain, diverts rage, and engages each of us in the greatest, the most intense of our chosen struggles. There are so many challenges out there in American society and beyond that can make us feel really hopeless about what the future looks like. And there's a survey of several surveys of college students and how you all are faring in this pandemic. And one of those numbers that's really important to think about, and why you need to find yourself a positive obsession, is that one of the numbers is that 67% of college students report that they're finding it really hard to be hopeful about and plan for their future, given the high level of uncertainty. And a sweet and powerful positive obsession that's making social change is one way in which you can invest your time in the here and now that will help here and now and help in the future that we're creating. So that's my end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keeles, for your thoughts about the situation in which we find ourselves. As I was listening, I have to be honest, part of my brain was listening with my now a few decades in the past experience of being a high school teacher myself and thinking about the work that teachers do. Did we just lose Dr. Keeles? Hello? Dr. Keeles? Uh-oh. Let's wait for just a moment. Dr. Keeles seems to have been disconnected. There she is. Hey, Dr. Keeles, we lost you for just a moment there.
Yeah.
Which is good. I have a few questions that we you. Actually, the first question that I really wanted to ask, as I said, it kind of comes out of my own experience of being a teacher, but also is directed at an aspect of your own research that you didn't talk about during this presentation. As an instructor, one of the things that I eventually came to understand, even though at the time I don't feel like I had good language for it, was sort of the ways in which students' individual or kind of collective experience of trauma really impacted their ability to learn. And I wondered if you could just spend a couple of minutes sort of commenting about the experience. I think we hear a lot of people throw out this idea that, oh, the pandemic has been traumatic. And I don't think they mean that in a very scientific or technical way, but actually it has been traumatic. And I think we're also in the midst of a mental health pandemic. And I don't feel like there's been a whole lot of discussion about the intersectional impacts of the traumatic experience of the pandemic intersecting with previous experiences of possibly chronic trauma in communities, and then the ways that those two things taken together impact educational attainment or the potential therefore. Could you say just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the things is first defining trauma, and trauma is, and so that is, it was a lot of the work that I did before, but now it really is just that obsession. It's taken over just about everything that I do, is the issue of trauma and how schools can respond. So trauma in this context, when we think about it, it's the psychological, emotional, spiritual. So it's not the event. It's not getting sick. It's not the loss of a loved one. It's not. It is how that affects our brains and our bodies, because it creates stress, and it's those kind of stress hormones. It is the worry that takes up cognitive space. It is when an intense event happens and it leaves you, and you haven't been able to process it all the way through, and it leaves you with the challenge of flashbacks. So you're in the classroom trying to focus on the material, but something happens that reminds you of that traumatic event, and you're pulled out of what we call your learning brain, which is focusing on what's the academic material, and you're pulled into coping with the stress and the anxiety and the worry about the traumatic event. One example when we're thinking about this is, for example, when we're talking about chronic trauma, if your home and or neighborhood is an unsafe place, or is a really stressful place, an anxiety producing place, while you're in school the whole time, one of the things that's running in the back of your heads is, how am I going to manage that when I leave school? And that then affects your ability to attend to the kind of like academic instructional content. So it's all of those pieces that's the trauma when we're thinking about this. It's how it affects our brain and how it affects the stress chemicals running through our bodies, because the stress chemicals themselves do what they're designed to do, which is they put the intensity of your brain functioning kind of on those lower emotional and instinctive areas, and less on the kind of higher order thinking that's needed for academic learning. So it's all of those things. So if you, for example, are a college student, and in your brain and in the way that you were thinking about things, because of the pandemic, it's closed schools, you no longer have your social, your peer relationships to, that's a part of what college life is. You can't see what the future is going to be. There's all of those things that are affecting your mood. And so you're just feeling hopeless and depressed. That affects your ability to, your executive functioning, which is what we call all of those things that help you organize yourself, organize the learning material, persist towards completing those assignments that even on a regular year, many students are like, what's the point of this again? But if you are on top of that, feeling kind of hopeless and depressed about the future, that adds further to like, I just can't motivate myself to like do this. And that's when our executive functioning kicks in, and we're like, okay, I don't see the point. I'm not really feeling excited about this, but I can organize myself and I can push towards a goal. When you overlay an emotional distress and trauma on top of it, really makes it hard to do all of those things. So it's real, kids, students, those things that you've been feeling, yes, it's real. So it's those things. And I think about those but if we know that, there are ways that we can do our teaching differently that attends to that, and that alleviates some of those, for example, self-organizing, executive functioning, self-persist towards an abstract and ambiguous goal, types of things, that the way we usually do school. So thinking about that, K-12 and college.
That actually brings me to something else that you mentioned earlier that I was so grateful for you to say. And that was kind of addressing the amount of emotional labor that goes into teaching and being a teacher. I think I underestimated it at the time, but I think about it a lot now, the extent to which a lot of the most kind of arduous parts of my day as a teacher. Not arduous, they were also the most rewarding, but some of the most laborful parts were, the moments in between the content delivery when I was talking with a student about something that was going on at home or something they were worried about, or providing a little bit of reassurance, and the extent to which those relationships can also be, on the one hand, motivating, but also kind of insulating, and maybe even responsive to some of these kind of emotional burdens that you're talking about. So I was really relieved to hear you mention that. I think I have to imagine, I'm not in the classroom these days very much, but I have to imagine that's been one of the greatest losses in the sudden removal of those really important relationships that students can rely on.
Yes, and you see, so when you're a teacher in the classroom, you see how students, you see and you feel, and you're much more aware of how they are receiving the academic content, and you adjust. So all day long, teachers are adjusting what they're doing, and it's much harder to do that on Zoom or Google Classrooms. And so it's those micro adjustments that are not there that are making it really difficult. Why online learning is such a challenge.
Well, and I think that also kind of calls to mind this question of, what's the availability, what's the attention potential for those people who are stepping in as the instructors at home. One of our attendees asked if you could just expand a little bit about sort of the inequality of the homeschooling experience, and sort of the intersectional ways in which parents have been able to attend to homeschooling their students. The example here, the example of women statistically taking on the majority of homeschooling duties, that also relates to another question that we got, which was, how much research do we have on the impacts of differences in the home environment on educational attainment prior to the pandemic? The attendee said, I feel like I've heard a lot of research about educational disparities based on differences in schools, but what did we already kind of know about the importance of home environments before we walked into this situation?
Home environments were hugely important before the pandemic. It's one way they used to talk about it is readiness for school. So your home environments played a big role in the extent to which kids were ready for school. Parents were and still are kids' first teachers. And that's also a way that educational inequality plays out from one generation to the next, because however prepared this current generation is, that's going to then play a big effect on how ready kids are for school. It plays a big effect on ability to support with homework and all of those other things. And so the schools were, before the pandemic, not very good at narrowing those home inequalities. So they were not very good before, but they did do something. And now it's just exploded, those home inequalities.
Another question that came out from the attendees, you've shown a lot of data about racialized divides in your presentation. Have we seen anything yet about kind of urban-rural divides and ways in which those may be playing out in the educational space?
I would say that's probably one of those areas that where things are really fuzzy, because some I don't work with any of them, but I work with several school districts, and some of them have talked about their neighboring school districts that were more rural, that they were like, nothing has changed there. So one aspect of the urban-rural divide with the pandemic is the level of spread. And this is one where there are several rural communities that kind of, they've had less community spread of and so less, when things shut down, they shut down for a shorter period of time. some didn't shut down at all. And so, and in terms of reopening this year also, so, but some have also been severely affected. And when rural communities are severely affected, they have less access to the remote learning technologies. So it's really a mix, and that's one where it's a really fuzzy picture right now, and we won't know probably for at least another year how that urban rural divide, because it's not clear. It's not clear cut.
It's in my sister and her husband and their children recently moved to Greene County, Virginia. And while in many ways they've been the envy of the rest of our family as we've watched them continuing to send pictures of wide open spaces and mountains, on the other hand, they've all been sharing a couple of kind of phone-based internet hotspots in order to participate in remote education, which is because there's no broadband. I hate to end on a down note, but I have one more question that feels like a real downer to me. Can you comment on ways in which punitive federal policies, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, could magnify the differentiations coming out of the pandemic?
Yeah, who knows? I have zero clue where education policy is gonna go because well, thank goodness for it's a moment of change. So there's an opportunity for change, but the policies have not been great for these types of things in the past because it has been that kind of, this is not what the policy says, but this is the way I read them, and the way they often play out is if you're struggling, we're going to take away resources. If you're struggling, if you get a failing designation, we are going to, we're going to punish you by giving you less of this. And it's kind of always been the not quite getting that logic of how some of those punitive consequences in those policies worked. And oftentimes what we learned very quickly, and they were adjusted in some ways, is that what we learned very quickly is that you're actually just, again, schools are being punished for serving a marginalized community that had few resources to begin with, and that's what you're seeing. It's not the school itself. It's those underlying vulnerabilities and challenges. But we initially, the policies understood them as a need to, well, if we take away things and punish you, you'll somehow figure out how to do more with even less. Like I said, though, my positive, though, is that nobody can argue that we should keep doing things the way we've been doing them. Nobody should argue, shouldn't be able to argue, but it takes time. We can't, we've always done it this way. We've always had summer. We've got to give them, and to me, I argue for year-round schooling, but not in the form that it is now. Year-round schooling, but not in the painful, mind-numbing assignment work, working through assignments that have no connection to kind of project-based learning or real-world learning, or there's just so many ways that we could do things so differently that we can't say, oh, but we can't change. We've always done it this way. We clearly can, quickly.
I've been thinking as you've been talking about the way in which New Orleans, to some extent, in the wake of Katrina, there was kind of a surge of educational innovation in that district. I wish I knew, I don't, sort of what the long-term outcomes of that had been, or if it eventually diverted back to business as usual. But I remember we're
going to end on a positive note and not discuss it. And that's because one of the big things they did was say, we're going to take our hands off and let charter schools figure it all out. And so they basically devolved to an almost complete charter school situation, which is not necessarily a problem. But we have a society where we have some kids and families that are going to take more resources to educate And we have to be committed to ensuring that they get the highest possible education. And so what can sometimes happen is families who need the most are not attractive to charter schools. I am 150% for innovation, 150%. I'll say that. And but like that last slide, it is acceleration, not remediation. It's innovation to make sure that they're challenged. It's innovation to do all of those things.
And it occurred to me looking at that last slide that many of the things that you sort of indicated as characteristics of a great acceleration program, none of these are actually innovative. It's just what would be innovative is extending this kind of education to the population that needs it the most. One last question for you, even though I've kept you a few extra minutes, but hopefully this is a good one. What are you teaching in the next year that students can take advantage of?
So I will be teaching an undergrad fall education inequality class that undergrads can take advantage of. And I have a reduced teaching load next year, but that's because, so I'm only teaching that one undergrad class in the fall, because I'm doing a lot of work with New York public schools in particular around trauma and around the transforming the way police work in schools in that district. So my positive obsession, I am literally in I counted it today, 5 meetings a week around police and schools in that district. And really, they're working hard to change, and also supporting Chicago public schools as they are thinking about how they can do some of that here also.
Thank you for making your positive obsession available to us this evening in the midst of a busy and, as we've repeatedly commented, exhausting time. We're so grateful for your time and your knowledge, and also for the great work that you do for our city and beyond. So thank you. Please join me. Okay. On behalf of the college at the University of Chicago, Chicago Studies, and the Parental Program for Public Discourse, we'd like to thank everyone for participating in this evening's presentation. The recording of this evening's session will be available on the Chicago Studies website later this week. Supplemental materials about this topic, including materials that were alluded to by Dr. Keeles and including links to Octavia Butler's work, will also be made available there. We'd like to remind you of many other upcoming Chicago Studies events, including a conversation that we're hosting between MWRD Commissioner Kimberly DuBouclet and WBEZ's Monica Ng about water management and equity in Chicago. That's taking place over Zoom tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Visit our website to register, and for more information on all of our upcoming programming and events, visit our events page. Our website also contains information about our upcoming undergraduate research prize, our May 26th colloquium, and our new student advisory board. Again, thank you for joining us this evening, and have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.